Somewhere in your garden this week, there is a coneflower blooming in the wrong color. You planted white, it came up pink. Or you bought that expensive orange one, where the tag cost more than the pot, and this July it is throwing plain purple flowers like it forgot who it was. Every garden center in America will tell you the same thing. It reverted. The fancy cultivar slipped back to its wild parent. That is not what happened. That plant did not change its mind. That plant died. And one of its own children came up in the same hole and took its place. And you never noticed, because you were watching the flowers instead of watching the ground. Once you see that, you cannot unsee it. And it changes every single thing you do to a coneflower in July. There is one flower standing in your bed right now that you need to pull out, roots and all, before dark. And there is another that looks almost exactly like it, that you should leave standing. Getting those two backwards is the most expensive mistake in the July garden. But before either of them, I have to show you the thing being decided in your soil today, in the middle of summer, that will not show its face until November. Drop your state or your zone in the comments. A coneflower in Zone 4 Minnesota and a coneflower in Zone 8 Georgia are two different animals. I read every one. Start with the plant itself, because everything else follows from it. At the Chicago Botanic Garden, a horticulturist named Richard Hawk, who runs their ornamental plant research, put 52 different coneflowers in the ground and watched them for 5 growing seasons. 274 plants, same soil, same weather, side by side. He did not fertilize them, he did not deadhead them, he did not spray them, he did not mulch them for winter. He watered when they needed it, pulled the weeds, and otherwise left them alone. More than half came out of that trial rated excellent or good, which ought to tell you something about most of the advice you have been handed. But one line in that report changed the way I garden. He writes that purple coneflower is short-lived. 2 or 3 years is common. 2 or 3 years. Not because your soil is bad, not because you did something wrong, because that is what the plant is. And since purple coneflower is a parent of nearly every showy hybrid on the shelf, that short life is handed straight down to them. So a coneflower is not a peony. It will not outlive you. It burns bright, sets seed, and hands the ground to the next one in line. Out on the prairie it came from, nothing ever kept individuals alive. The prairie kept ground. Plants crossed it like weather, for 10,000 years. That is the whole video. You have been trying to keep a plant alive. You should have been keeping a population going. Which brings me to the thing almost nobody tells you about July. Hawk saw the same pattern repeat year after year. Walk out in late autumn and look at the base of your coneflowers. Some have a full, leafy mound of green right at the ground. Others look fine enough up top, but down at the crown, almost nothing. A bare knuckle and a few tired leaves. The plants with the full basal mound came through the winter. The plants with the bare crown very often did not. Of the 274 plants, 75 died over winter, and the losses were not blamed on cold. These were plants rated hardy, far past the temperatures they actually saw. The deaths were put down to plants going into winter weak, and to soil that stayed wet. Now read that backwards with me. That mound of low leaves in November is a bank account. It holds the sugars that keep the crown alive through 5 months of darkness, and it is filled by the leaves standing on the plant right now, in July. So the real question this month is not, how do I get more flowers? The real question is, does the thing I am about to do build the basal mound, or spend it? Every healthy leaf you strip, every stem you shear, every disease that takes the foliage, every beetle that turns a leaf into lace, every day the plant sits in soggy soil burning energy just to survive instead of storing it. All of it is a withdrawal. July does not decide your flowers. July decides November, and November decides whether you have a plant at all. Nobody can sell you that. There is no bottle of it, which is exactly why you have never heard it said out loud. So, water. This is where careful, loving gardeners kill coneflowers. Drought-tolerant does not mean the plant enjoys being dry. It means it survives being dry. What it cannot survive is the opposite. Roots do not only drink, roots breathe. Down in the dark, root cells burn sugar, and to burn sugar they need oxygen. and they take it from the air spaces between the crumbs of soil. Fill those spaces with water, and the oxygen is gone within hours. And a warm, wet, airless root zone is not just uncomfortable. It is an invitation. The water molds behind crown rot come alive exactly when the oxygen runs out. Some of them literally swim. So the coneflower that collapses in a wet July did not catch a disease out of nowhere. It suffocated first. Then it was eaten. Here is what to do, and it costs nothing. Stop watering on a schedule. Push a thin stick into the soil beside the plant, 4 or 5 inches down. Cool and damp down there, you walk away, no matter how dry the surface looks. Dry all the way down, you water once, slowly, at the soil surface, and then leave it alone until it dries again. An established coneflower in real ground may want water 3 or 4 times all summer. One you planted this spring is still sitting in the shape of the pot it came in, so check that one twice a week in the heat. And the crown, that woody knuckle at the soil line where the stems come out of the ground, must never sit wet. Pull your mulch back off it. Give it a hand's width of clear, open ground. On heavy clay, a shallow collar of coarse grit against the crown lets it dry after every storm. Mulch belongs on the soil. Mulch does not belong on the plant. One more free lever, and this one is the clock. A fungal spore landing on a leaf needs liquid water sitting there, for hours, before it can break in. Water at the ground early in the morning, and the leaves are bone dry by afternoon. Water overhead in the evening, and you have handed every spore a 10-hour swimming pool. Same water, same hose, completely different outcome. Now, the flopping. Every July, somebody sees a coneflower lying across the path and reaches for 2 things: a stake and a bag of fertilizer. Both are wrong. A plant can see its neighbors, not with eyes, with light. Leaves absorb red light and bounce back far red, the wavelength just past what your eye can pick up. So a coneflower standing in a crowd gets light thrown back at it heavy and far red, and it reads that signature and works out, quite correctly, that it is about to be shaded out. So it does what any prairie plant would do. It runs for the light. Taller, faster, longer, and thinner and softer between each pair of leaves. That is your flop. That is not a weak plant. That is a crowded plant making a rational decision. Now pour a handful of nitrogen on top, and you have thrown gasoline on the fire. Soft, watery growth, thin walls, and the first thunderstorm lays the clump flat. And here is the part that will annoy some people. Those bloom booster fertilizers, loaded with phosphorus, promising more flowers. Coneflowers do not feed themselves alone. They run their nutrition through a partnership with fungi in the soil. Fine fungal threads, far finer than any root, push out into the ground, reach water and nutrients no root can reach, and trade them to the plant for sugar. That partnership is why a coneflower can stand in a drought and look at you calmly. And when the soil is loaded with soluble phosphorus, the plant quietly stops paying for it. Why keep a supplier on contract when the goods are lying on the counter for free? So you buy the bloom booster, and you fire the fungus that was making your plant drought-proof. Dr. Linda Chalker-Scott, Extension urban horticulturist at Washington State University, has made a related point for years. Those bottles of mycorrhizal fungi sold to fix this. Most living garden soil already has these fungi in it. What breaks the partnership is not the absence of a product. It is high fertility, disturbance, and bare dug over ground. You do not buy the network. You just stop breaking it. So, for a floppy coneflower in July, no fertilizer, none. Open up the neighbors and let some light in low. Make a note to cut the plant back by a third next early June, before it ever gets tall, and it will come back shorter and sturdier. And this year, let it lean. A leaning coneflower still makes seed, and in a few minutes you will understand why seed is the whole point. Before I show you the strangest thing in the July garden, one bit of housekeeping. Everything here is in a free printed guide. The November rule, the watering test, the 2 look-alike flowers side by side so you can tell them apart at a glance. A year 1 to year 3 timeline of what to honestly expect, and the real sources with real names so you can read them yourself and come back and tell me where I got it wrong. There is a code on the screen. Point your phone at it. No sign up, no email, nothing to buy. Print it, Take it to the garden. Hand it over the fence to whoever needs it. Now, the strangest thing in the July garden. Go and look at your coneflowers. Really look. If you find one where the flower has turned green, where the petals are stubby, spoon-shaped, the wrong color, or where the cone in the middle has sprouted little leafy tufts, like a tiny green broom growing out of the top of the flower, stop. That is aster yellows, and what is happening inside that plant is one of the most extraordinary things I have ever read. It is not a fungus. It is not a virus. It is a bacterium. Stripped down so far it cannot survive outside a living body at all. It lives in the phloem, the sugar pipes of the plant, and it got there because a small insect, the aster leafhopper, fed on an infected plant somewhere else, picked it up, flew, and landed on yours. Researchers at the John Innes Center in England, in a group led by Dr. Saskia Hogenhout, worked out exactly what this bacterium does. It makes a protein, and that protein goes hunting inside the plant for the control proteins that tell a flower how to be a flower. The master instructions, the blueprint for a petal. And it destroys them. The plant is holding the instructions for a petal, and the bacterium reaches in and shreds them. So that tissue does the only other thing it knows how to do. It becomes a leaf. That green flower is not a sick flower. That green flower is a flower that has been overwritten. And it gets stranger. The plant is now sterile. It will never set a seed again as long as it lives. And plants carrying that protein become more attractive to the very leafhoppers that spread it. The bacterium has turned your coneflower into a billboard, advertising itself to the exact insect that will carry it to the next plant. The scientists who published that work used a phrase I have never been able to forget. They called them zombie plants. There is no cure, no spray, nothing you can buy at any price on any shelf, and it is not only in the flower you are looking at. It travels down, it overwinters, and it multiplies in the roots. That plant gets worse every year it stands there. In the Chicago trial, 13% of the plants were lost to it. In 2 earlier coneflower trials at the same garden, every single coneflower got infected, every one. They could not even publish the results, and they found no evidence that any variety resists it. The healthy plants were not tougher. They were lucky. The leafhopper had not landed on them yet. So here is the hardest thing I will ask you to do all summer. Take the whole plant, not the flower, the whole plant, dug out, with as much root as you can lift, the same day, into a bag, into the trash. Do not compost it. Do not leave it lying at the end of the bed while you think it over. And I know how that feels. You are standing over a plant that still has green leaves on it, and I am asking you to end it. Do it anyway. Because this does not only take coneflowers, it takes coreopsis, asters, marigolds, chrysanthemums. It gets into lettuce and carrots. That plant is not just sick, it is a source. And one free thing genuinely helps. The leafhoppers pick this up from weeds, so keep the rough, grassy, weedy edges of your garden mown and clean, especially the fence line, where nobody ever looks. That is not a chore. That is disease control. Now, the flower you leave standing, there is a mite, an area-feed mite, far too small to see, that crawls down inside a developing coneflower bud and feeds. The cone reacts by pushing out tufts of green growth, sometimes a whole rosette of little leaves out of the top. Gardeners call it coneflower rosette, and it looks close enough to aster yellows to make you panic and start digging. Here is how you tell them apart, and it is not subtle once you know. Aster yellows takes the whole plant. Foliage yellows, curls, puckers. Stems shorten. More than one flower is wrong. The plant, taken as a whole, does not look like itself anymore. The mite only takes the cone. One flower, or a few, with odd growth on top, and everything else on that plant perfectly, boringly normal. And here is what the internet gets wrong. Mite damage is cosmetic. The Chicago report says it plainly. It does not harm the plant long term. Snap off the affected heads, bag them, and the plant blooms clean later in the season. What the mite does cost you is seed. And in about 2 minutes you will understand why that, and not the plant's health, is the thing about it that actually matters. And if you truly cannot tell which one you are looking at, do not guess, and do not ask a stranger on the internet. Nearly every state has a university extension plant diagnostic laboratory. Send them a photograph. Your taxes already paid for it, and hardly anybody uses it. Which brings me to the part I expect to be argued with about, and I am looking forward to it. You have been taught to deadhead. Cut every faded flower, keep it blooming, keep the bed tidy. And that is not wrong, exactly. Cut a spent bloom back to the next side bud or branching point, not just under the cone, and the plant pushes more flowers. That works. I do it myself. But go back to what we learned at the start. Purple coneflower lives 2 or 3 years. It stays in a garden the same way it stayed on the prairie, by replacing itself. So read what that Chicago report actually says about deadheading. It improves the display, yes, and it reduces seedlings, and it takes away the seed source for the birds. Now hold that against the other thing they watched over 5 years. Seedlings kept appearing, and those seedlings grew into the gaps where the original plants had died. They filled the holes. Sometimes a seedling replaced its own parent so smoothly that nobody noticed until the flower opened, and it was the wrong color. There it is. That is your reverted coneflower. That was never a reversion. That was a funeral and a birth in the same square foot of soil, and somebody told you a fairy tale about a plant changing its mind. So look hard at what deadheading really is on a plant like this. Deadhead every flower, every year, right to the end of the season, and you get a tidy bed, and no seedlings. And then in year 3, when the parent does the thing it was always going to do, there is nothing standing behind it. The bed thins, the clumps shrink, and you decide you failed. You did not fail. You were sterilizing your garden and calling it maintenance. So here is what I do. Deadhead the first flush, all through July, cut the spent blooms to the next bud, and the plant keeps flowering, and the bed looks good, and you get your show. Then somewhere in the middle to the end of August, put the pruners down. Let that last flush stand. Let it brown, let it stiffen, let it make seed. That is not laziness. That is the entire strategy. Those seed heads feed goldfinches from autumn through the hungriest part of winter, and I would keep them for that alone. But there is more. Those seed heads are the next generation of your coneflower bed, and they were not selected by a breeder in a greenhouse in Oregon. They were selected by your soil, your drainage, your winter. The ones that come up and survive in your garden are, by definition, the ones that can survive in your garden. Nobody can sell you that plant. It does not exist anywhere else on earth. And there is one thing to do this week that takes 30 seconds and pays you back for years. Walk out with a strip of ribbon. Find the coneflower that looks best right now. The one that came through last winter with the most life in it, standing straight and clean while its neighbors sulk. Tie the ribbon on it. That is your mother plant. That is the one you leave to seed. And in October, that is the one you shake out over a patch of bare ground. You have just started breeding a coneflower for your own garden, for free, and it took you half a minute. So tell me, do you let yours go to seed, or do you cut every last one? Be honest with me, because I know how many of you were taught that a spent flower is untidy, and a good gardener cuts it. Has a volunteer seedling ever outlived the plant you actually paid for? I want to hear about it. Japanese beetles. Quickly, because one thing here is worth more than everything else you have been told about them. They do not arrive alone. Beetles already feeding put out a scent that calls more beetles in. Most people know that much. But there is a second signal, and this is the one that gets missed. A leaf being chewed gives off its own smell. Damaged plant tissue is loud, and that smell pulls beetles in from a distance all on its own. So the plant covered in lacy, skeletonized leaves is not just a victim, it is an advertisement. And every day you leave that damage standing, the advertisement keeps running. Go out early, while it is cool and they are slow and stupid. Hold a jar of soapy water under the flower and tap. They drop straight in. They do not fly when they are cold. 5 minutes a morning through the first 2 weeks breaks the back of it. Then take the worst of the chewed leaves off and bag them. You are not just removing beetles, you are taking down the sign. Do not hang a pheromone trap near your bed. Those traps pull beetles in from well outside your property, and plenty of them stop off at your flowers on the way past. And never spray anything onto an open coneflower. That cone is covered in bees from breakfast until supper, and whatever the label says it targets, the bee cannot read the label. Every leaf you save from the beetles is a leaf that fills the bank account. Every leaf is November. 3 things not to do this month. Do not divide. Splitting a plant in July asks it to rebuild an entire root system in the hottest weeks of the year, with nothing in reserve. Mark the crowded clump now, divided in early autumn once the heat breaks. And know this, because almost nobody says it. Purple coneflower will take division. But the prairie species with deep taproots, the pale purple coneflower, the narrow leaf, the yellow one, those do not divide at all. They are not built in pieces. You will simply kill them. If you want more of those, what you want is seed. Do not fertilize a plant that looks sick. A pale, sulking coneflower in July is almost never hungry. It is drowning, or parched, or crowded, or chewed, or carrying something you have not spotted. Nitrogen on top of any of those gives you a taller, softer, sicker plant and does nothing about the actual problem. Feeding is not a diagnosis. And the third one I want to handle carefully, because many of you were told to do this by people who meant nothing but well. Hydrogen peroxide. The advice going around is to take the brown bottle out of the medicine cabinet, mix it with water, spray it on the leaves to kill mildew spores, and pour it into the soil to, and I am quoting, re-oxygenate the root zone. I wanted to be fair to it, so I went and looked properly. And the first thing worth saying is this. That is not old country wisdom handed down from anybody's grandmother. Nobody's grandmother had a bottle of hydrogen peroxide in the potting shed. It is a modern internet idea wearing a farmer's coat. A tablespoon of the drugstore bottle in a cup of water gives you a solution of about 0.2%. It fizzes, which is satisfying, and then it is gone. Peroxide breaks down in soil almost instantly. The oxygen you get from it lasts minutes, not days, nowhere near enough to rescue a waterlogged root zone. And on the way through it is not fussy about what it burns. It oxidizes whatever it touches, including the fine root hairs and the soil life you spent years building. Fixing wet soil with a splash of peroxide is like bailing out a boat with a teaspoon while the hole is still open. If your coneflower crown is rotting, the answer is not a chemical, it is drainage. Pull the mulch off the crown, open the soil around it, and if that spot in your garden stays wet, then that spot is not a coneflower spot, and no bottle on earth changes it. Move the plant in autumn, raise the bed, or grow something there that loves wet feet, and be glad about it. And for leaves that spot and yellow and drop, which matters far more on a coneflower than a little powdery mildew ever will, because dropped leaves mean an empty bank account in November, that answer is free too. Water at the ground, in the morning. Give the plants air, and pick the fallen spotted leaves up off the soil, instead of leaving them at the crown to reinfect next spring's growth. It costs nothing, and unlike the brown bottle, it works. So, the whole thing back together. You have a plant that lives 2 or 3 years and survives by handing the ground to its children. What it needs from you in July is not devotion. It needs a crown that can breathe. It needs the leaves it already has. It needs no fertilizer whatsoever. And it needs your permission to make seed. Build the basil mound, and you will see that plant again in spring. Let the seed fall, and you will see that plant again in 10 years. And that is the thing about the prairie. In 10,000 years, it never once kept a single plant alive. Not one. It kept the ground. It kept the soil open and living and fed, and it let the plants come and go across it like weather, generation after generation, without a single bag of fertilizer and without a single bottle of anything. You are not the owner of those coneflowers. You are the ground they are passing through. Look after the ground, and the flowers will keep coming back long after you have forgotten which one you planted and which one just showed up on its own. So go out this evening, when it cools off. Take the ribbon with you. And leave me 2 things before you go, your state or your zone, so I know who I am talking to, and the argument. Do you cut every last spent flower, or do you let them stand? I have told you what I think. Now tell me where I am wrong. I read every comment, every single one.